By 2024, 80% of ordering and replenishment will be touchless for most organizations. And the current COVID-19 pandemic resulted in even more companies investing heavily in digitalization channels and their processes. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all, and thank you for watching the first webinar of a series of 3 around the distribution revolution. My name is Steffi Veen. I'm a digital strategist at Valtech Netherlands, and with me are Randy Woods, Senior Business Director of E-commerce Practices. Welcome, Randy.
Morning.
And Mark Pepin, Senior Director, E-commerce Practice. Welcome, Randy. Mark. That was great.
Hi, everyone.
Today we will be discussing trends and challenges and opportunities in B2B distribution. And leveraging their extensive digital experience, Mark and Randy will explain how to stay successful in these challenging times. Today we will dive into these challenges and opportunities, and then in the next session we will be more focused around what you can actually do to survive in this space. And then in the third session of this series of webinars, we will more deep dive into how you actually enable them. Before we dive into the content, I already want to invite you a little bit because at the end of today's session, you will get the opportunity to share your key challenges and focus areas for the upcoming 8 to 36 months. Because we really look forward to getting the insights on improving our services and touch points. And we also want to give you the opportunity to win a 2-hour digital maturity assessment workshop with Valtech. So if you fill out the survey at the end of the session, you could actually be one of the lucky ones. So the digital revolution requires business leaders to really shift from just selling products to serving and meeting and even exceeding customer needs. And that is not only true in a B2C context, definitely not. We see that it's becoming more and more important also in the B2B context. People simply expect the same experience with their suppliers as they experience in everyday life. So, Mark and Randy, can you elaborate on what type of changes in behavior and needs impact B2B distribution?
I think it's fair to say that even before COVID struck, distributors and wholesalers were seeing a significant change in their business models or threat to the existing historical ways of doing business. We were seeing the rise of marketplaces. We were seeing manufacturers going direct to consumer. We were seeing digital eating all the additional business processes. So there was already a revolution happening, and that's really only accelerated with COVID. And one thing you can look at, surveys suggest that 1 in 3 buyers today prefer to buy online rather than speaking to a sales representative. But when you actually survey the millennials who are entering or are in the marketplace today, they're much more likely to prefer to buy online than to deal with a sales rep. And your question then becomes, if relationships are your core of your business, how do you adapt in this new world? Is that fair, Mark?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Randy. And also, not to boil things down to just the basics, but in terms of distribution, it really is, how do you differentiate yourselves? And certainly some of those things are the knowledge of the products that you are repping, and certainly the relationships that you have with your customers. Along the lines in terms of the digital transformation, what's also important is customers clearly want self-service. They want the ability to be informed, and also to look at things like order statuses and deliveries and all of those kinds of things that are critical to them. And they want to do that on their time and certainly on their terms.
Yeah, and historically, there's been significant friction for a client to switch from one distributor to another, or one manufacturer or wholesaler to another. But we're seeing the same thing that happened to the B2C supply chain, where the digital revolution is reducing those switching costs. So it's harder to keep long-term customers than it was historically. And we think that's a trend that's going to accelerate.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah,
so
and
you already mentioned a couple of things actually, Mark, because how could distributors actually address those needs? And you already mentioned a couple of them, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that.
yeah. It really is how can you empower the organizations to do business with you in a frictionless manner, and especially from a perspective of giving me workplace automation that makes my job as one of your customers easier. So therefore, it creates that stickiness. So you've got a scenario whereby if I have a great relationship with you that's trusted, where you are adding value, and of course, at that point, you make it easy for me to do business with you through the use of different tools that are available on your site. Then what happens is it gives me the ability to do my job easier. And from that perspective, there's value that is very important to me that I'm willing to obviously continue to do business with you. So it's not necessarily a defensive approach as we start talking about marketplaces, but as we've seen before, B2B customers are expecting B2C experiences. And certainly from that perspective, that is going to continue from a standpoint of if you make my job easier, I'm actually willing to pay a premium for that. So it doesn't become a price conversation.
Yeah, I think it does make some sense, right? Because it's not just the convenience factor, it actually reduces the cost for your customers as well if you can make it easier, make replenishment automated, for example. And I think what we do see is that distributors that are able to really think through the needs of their end consumers are more successful with shifting into the digital revolution. We worked with Henkel, for example, in Europe, and part of what we did there was look very carefully at the specific needs of the clients, and that led us to build a knowledge base that combined with the buying opportunity, and it was very persona driven, so that engineers saw different content that specifically mapped to their needs while they were in the purchasing process as compared to somebody who's in logistics. And similarly, we thought through if someone's on their mobile phone, what information do they need in that context as opposed to when they're sitting at a desktop or on the plant floor. And so by doing that work to really understand your consumers first and then build the best possible experience for them, you do start rebuilding those defensive barriers that or switching costs that allow you to hang on to your customers.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay. So we discussed the changing customer needs and behaviors. You already addressed a couple of ideas on how to tap into that. There's another topic, there's another topic that people in general really enjoy, and it's a concept of marketplaces. And again, that's not only true in the B2C space. You all bought probably something at Amazon once, or at least once, but it's also emerging more and more in B2B markets. And specifically because it provides customers the ability to easily compare products, to easily compare prices, delivery times, filter and find the stuff they need quickly. And besides distributors starting their own digital marketplaces, we also see independent B2B marketplaces such as Amazon Business and Alibaba gaining ground in many markets. So let's have a look at one stat. The growth, if you, for example, look at Amazon Business for the last year, they've been growing 67%. They grew from 6 billion in 2018 to 16 billion in 2019. And Alibaba Group in the B2B space, they grew 51%. In the meanwhile, they have 150,000 sellers and over 10 million active buyers. So what can you tell us about the impact of these two pure players and maybe even more pure players on industrial distribution, and how can distributors actually leverage their success?
So I think the real key here is to pay attention to what happened previously to the B2C supply chain, because it's being replicated almost identically in the B2B supply chain. There's simply no way that Amazon and Alibaba are going to ignore the business-to-business side of the world. It's just too many dollars, and they're both more than equipped to invest heavily for many years. So you need a strategy to deal with the marketplaces. That's the first thing. You can't ignore them. There's a recent survey done of North American distributors, and in virtually every vertical, Amazon is now ranking in the top 5 as a distributor, and they were absent 5 years ago, to give you a sense of the growth rate. So you need to find a way to, you need a strategy for dealing with them, whether you partner with them, sell through them, whether you compete with them, whether you do both. It's important that you understand how to proceed. And what you really need to think about is what can you do as a distributor that these marketplaces can't? And that often falls to things like relationships. or new services, or bundling knowledge in a way that's accessible to them, that simply can't be done by the marketplaces, which are more abstracted from the end customer.
Yeah, and I think along those lines as well, look, if you look at from a marketplace perspective, by definition, most B2B distributors are a marketplace in and of themselves, right? But again, adding the added services and the value and the IP around what products you're selling into what verticals essentially is a key, way for you to do things that these other marketplaces cannot. Along those same lines from that standpoint is, depending upon what kind of product you're representing, especially if there are complex selling cycles to these products, this is where the IP that you have about those products is, a huge gap with these two marketplaces here. So capitalize on that. And we talk about the ability of switching channels during that sales cycle, whereby, to use the term channel-less, it's a scenario where during that sales cycle, how do you use your digital touch points to switch between the different channels so that way there it becomes an extension of your service to that customer.
Yeah, and that gets to all sorts of topics, Mark, like facilitated selling. Can your account managers actually sit with the clients and help them navigate on your site to get the products
Right.
they need? Or alternatively, if there's a client who's midway through the buying process on your e-commerce enabled system and they're struggling, they can't find the product mix, they're not sure which discounts apply, being able to make them very simple for them to switch to their existing account manager, account rep. That channel switching piece is something which the marketplaces can't do and aren't interested in. So in the long term, your relationship with the client as a distributor is still the most important thing that you own. Finding a way to facilitate that with digital technologies becomes the key to thriving in a world where marketplaces are rising.
Yeah, because Amazon and Alibaba, they're really good in selling like more commodity products, easy products, but they're still trying to figure out the more complex products in a lot of different markets. So maybe you can elaborate also a little bit around leveraging your industry knowledge and maybe also how we did that in some of our clients, because we really leverage that.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that Amazon and Alibaba are likely to be most successful when the products being sold are fairly simple and straightforward, they're fairly easy to ship, and there's not a lot of geographical boundaries, right? Because that's where they have effectiveness and scale in a way that individual distributors can really struggle to achieve. So when the flip side of that becomes your advantage. So for a number of our clients, Norion in Europe, for example, who sells chemicals, we help them figure out how to bundle those and make them transparent so that it was easy for their customers to continue purchasing them. It's a complex sale, so understanding how to assemble this required deep industry knowledge and product knowledge, and then embedding that online in a way that makes it straightforward for the end buyer was really key to helping them transition from a handshake level of doing business and replicating that online, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And now you turned on the fire alarm again, Randy. Thanks for that.
Yes, I apologize for that. Somebody has decided to test the fire alarm right in the middle of this. And I should emphasize too that the key, I think, to this is again thinking through your relationship with your consumers over time. So we talk about user journeys, not moments. And you already have that relationship. So in a large way, distributors have an advantage over some of our other customers and other verticals because you know your customers intimately. And it's a matter of understanding that journey and attempting to replicate it online. And that leads you to observations. So we have a few clients, Lavin in Europe, where we help them understand that in their case, they're delivering construction supplies. They're delivering to places that don't have addresses yet. They haven't been built. So how do you address that during the e-commerce process? Or in the case of Bools, there was concern about theft if delivery was happening outside of the hours when somebody was present at the site. So how do you address that in a digital fashion? And how do you connect that to what your account reps know about that specific client? So there's something there about understanding the end consumer's pain points and being really responsive to those, which frankly would be very difficult for someone like an Amazon or an Alibaba to do.
Yeah, and along those same lines is looking beyond the marketplace too, from a digital transformation perspective, it's where do you have the ability to have intelligence built into that supply chain? In a scenario where Linde, which is an air gas company, we actually have IoT within their containers. And at that point, it basically does the metering for them and automatically sends a replenishment replacement so that they can actually then deliver the gas into the container. So it's these types of things, again, as we say, you know your customer, you're using technology, you're making it very simple for them, it's frictionless, and that creates that additional value that is really hard to replicate in just an open marketplace.
Well, I mean, I think if you're clever in your execution, and we'll talk next time, I think a lot more about how you make your account managers more effective. So I don't want to scoop us from next time. But in the Linde example, you now have data about replenishment rates, when replenishment is likely to happen next, equipping your account reps, your field team with that information so they can have well-timed and well-informed conversations, can help deepen that relationship. And really, if you're taking the paperwork off the hands of your account reps, it gives them more time to do the relationship building and to act as that trusted advisor, which otherwise they would spend filling in paper reports. And so there's a value there, which is almost an offshoot of shifting the routine work to digital technologies.
Yeah, and then your sales folks get to be the relationship builders, as Randy mentioned, but also you're not paying them just to be performing administration tasks in terms of, you know, becoming an order taker. You can use your capabilities to obviously let that run its own course. And then of course you get into the scenario where you can use those sales reps to do just that, to acquire new customers, certainly to reactivate lapsed customers and those types of things. So for your total cost of ownership and shifting that to the relationship-based approach certainly is a win-win.
Yeah, I think next time we will go in more depth also. Oh, sorry, I was interrupting you, Randy. I think you had an addition on that.
Oh no, your point is well made. We don't want to skip ourselves for next time. But I did want to comment that part of knowing your customers, part of the advantage of knowing your customers, is it allows you to create new services or to bundle products and services in a way that simply hasn't been seen before. We have one client, for example, who no longer simply distributes products, but they actually take the refuse away for recycling and actually deal with the toxic waste as well. So it's a brand new set of services, and it's hard to imagine that an Alibaba would be in a position to understand that market deeply enough to understand that need exists and then to execute on that. And so will that require some level of service innovation? It's useful. And I was thinking of one of our clients, Dario, who had always had this ability to create custom products, but when they shifted to an online buying channel, they saw a 300% increase in the number of custom products created because suddenly it was simpler, easier to understand, more transparent. So it's the digital channel doesn't just give you an opportunity to do what you've done historically more effectively. It can actually let you innovate new services, which then again provide an alternative to competing directly with the marketplaces on price.
Yeah, and along those lines, we have a customer, Westcon, who is a large distributor of UCC equipment, and their value proposition is just that. They add additional value services through configuration and training and implementation and those types of things. And a lot of the products that they sell are actually subscription-based products. And by automating all of that stuff, what it does do is they recognize, $60+ million that they were leaving on the table, and those were their words. We're leaving this on the table because there was no way to really manage and identify when those subscriptions were coming up for renewal. And by using automation there, what it then does for them is obviously it's a great retention strategy. It uncovers new streams of revenue for them. And certainly it's not a heavy lift for the sales force to then get these renewals, because at that point in time, it's predominantly an automated process.
Yeah, I think a lot of the things that you're saying really comes down to, if you leverage the fact that you know your customers and really use that, you could do better than marketplaces. And I think basically all our cases are around that, knowing your customers, leveraging that data and insights. And I think it's a very nice bridge also towards next time to do a more a deep dive on that. The other thing I also wanted to discuss with you is the following, because as a response to emerging independent marketplaces, you also see a growing number of businesses starting their own B2B marketplaces. So actually, according to Gartner, they mentioned that within 3 years, over 70% of first-party marketplaces will serve B2B buyers. So can you explain why building an enterprise marketplace could be beneficial to B2B businesses?
Well, it's interesting because in my mind, if you're a distributor of multiple manufacturers' products and you have a website that sells those online, you're kind of getting into marketplace territory already, right? Like people are able to shop across a broad range of manufacturers. The distinction being in marketplaces, usually the manufacturers would manage their own content and that kind of thing. So there's some slight details, but there's certainly a continuum between a distributor's website and say Amazon or Alibaba. You have to decide where you want to play. And again, this is a strategic decision because there's very little point in setting up a site that competes directly against Amazon, doing exactly what Amazon does, because not to be pessimistic, but I think that's a pretty big challenge to take on Amazon and run the board. But if you can't find a niche where you have specific advantages or you're able to take advantage of the dynamics of the distributor marketplace, I think there's some real advantages. And an example would be, many distributors have regional distribution contracts. It can get quite complex. And again, that's something that's very difficult for a large universal distributor like Amazon to reflect. And so we've had clients where we've helped them build a marketplace where the marketplace using personalization, so geographic personalization, was able to respect those regional contracts and make sure that the visitors were directed to the right contractual arrangements in a way that actually made sense for them in context, and made sure that all of the stakeholders in the entire system felt that they were being respected and there was nothing that was offside. So Seweldo, which was a client of ours in Europe, did this in the welding space, the welding equipment space, with 30 separate product lines, and was able to do this in a way that didn't put them offside any pre-existing relationships. And so there's an example where setting up a marketplace solved a very real need in the market. It simplified life for all of the stakeholders involved, and it did it in a way that I think the large marketplaces like Amazon or Alibaba would really have struggled to have executed. So in that case, it absolutely made sense to do a marketplace. Again, if all you're doing is replicating what Amazon does, I'm not entirely certain that you're going to be successful.
True.
Yeah, and I think, Randy, you touch on a good point there as well, because we already alluded that by definition, B2B distributors are a marketplace in and of themselves. But one of the things to think about in terms of your positioning and your marketing strategies, where it becomes super important, especially as, like, we know 90% of people are using search engines to find products, right? So SEO and digital marketing and paid placement and social selling, those all apply to B2B marketplaces and to you as a distributor. The thing is what we often see many times is that all of your product content is really behind a login. So it's not even spiderable by these search engines. So you need to think about SEO strategy. So therefore, even if you have exclusive rights in a territory, you have the ability to be seen. Your customers, or even new customers that you don't even know of yet, they are not going to Google and typing in, I'm looking for an electronics B2B distributor. They're looking for a specific product, a specific model, specific types of things that suit their needs. You need to be there, because if you're not, guess what? The other marketplaces are.
Really. Mark,
right?
I just want to really emphasize that, because yes, often people are searching by SKU number, and if you're not showing up to your people in your region for that SKU number, and Amazon is, you're at a very real risk of losing that client. And this is a strategic decision you have to make. What do you keep locked behind the firewall, not a paywall, a registration? What do you make available to the search engines so that it can be seen? And how do you structure that? And I would argue that, well, that's not often thought of as a key piece of the transformation. The emphasis is on, well, how do we expose order status? Thinking that piece through, what content will we own long-term as a strategic advantage and what will we make public, is a critical decision point for distributors, because it is something that you can do, which Amazon can't do, but if you don't do it, Amazon eats the world. So keep that in mind, Mark. I'm glad you raised it. It's not something I thought of immediately.
Yeah, but there's another thing to first-party marketplaces, because you have the independent marketplaces, the pure players, Amazon and Alibaba, Then as a distributor, if you start doing your sales digitally, then you eventually you are an independent marketplace or first party marketplace, but you also see manufacturers doing the same thing. So they are starting up their own marketplaces. We have a very interesting, well, it's more on the B2C side, a case from an FMCG company. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to share, but if I'm an FMCG company starting their own marketplace. So that's actually a threat to industrial distribution. How do you look at that?
So I think there's a few things there. Many manufacturers were experimenting with direct to end consumer prior to COVID. Those experiments accelerated dramatically when they lost their channel to market. And that's true, I think, both B2C, B2B, the supply chains writ large are kind of being rewritten by COVID almost in real time. So once that capacity has been gained by the manufacturers, it's hard to believe they're not going to continue to exploit it, even as we rationalize the world post-COVID. So I think that's a very real threat. Having said that, generally speaking, manufacturers carry their products, and they're certainly incented to sell their products, even if they actually bundle other ones with them, where a distributor can still have a role as an honest broker in bringing multiple manufacturers to market, providing the knowledge as an independent supplier of these to their client base on what would work, what bundles make most sense, what discount bundles are available. Everything that's been done in person by the account managers historically, that same value still applies. We have to find a way to do it that is easier for your end customers to consume. And a key to that, sorry, Mark, is that if you use Alibaba or Amazon as a channel, or if you rely simply on your account managers, you lose the data. Opening your own marketplace, at least in that situation, you have access to the data. You know about trends, you know about surges in demand, and that's something which gets lost if you're relying on selling directly through Amazon. Mark, I stepped on you. Do you have a comment on that as well?
Well, look, we're coming up on 3 minutes here, so I didn't want to.
I'll be quiet.
Yeah, no worries. But I'll leave you with this thought around that. Think about it the inverse of that model as well, in terms of opening up your systems so that other companies can actually do business with you much easier. And it doesn't necessarily have to be where it is a scenario where the products that you have in your product catalog or the portfolio that you represent, look at ways of how open systems then allow other businesses to just, where there is product affinity, would then get to a scenario where they can create or participate in a marketplace that they otherwise wouldn't. You know, one use case that comes to mind is there is a furniture store, and traditionally they sell, you know, couches and chairs and mattresses and end tables. Occasionally they'll sell some lamps and things like that. By plugging into other distributors that also rep things for soft goods like sheets and drapes and stuffed pillows and all of these kinds of things, there's a natural affinity. So when I'm buying a couch, or I am looking at that couch where it is in a setting, I can then, of course, you know, shop those drapes, shop that rug, look at all of those complementary things that optimally, they don't even necessarily have to deliver those products because they're partnering with these other marketplaces.
And Mark, I think just to promo our third session in this series, we're going to talk a little bit about the technologies required to do that, some of the approaches that actually make that available. So sorry, Steffi, I'll hand it over to you because we're almost out of time.
Yeah, great. We'll do that. So we've just discussed, and Randy and Mark, you both mentioned it already, we just discussed the tip of the iceberg of what we see happening in the industrial distribution. But all in all, we believe now is the time to invest in digital tools and services and really start improving the sales experience for your customers and empower your sales teams to do their job better and easier and faster. And social distancing as well as travel restrictions have further accelerated this need for, let's say, low or no touch buying.